everybody? Welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it's µ-Ziq, odds and ends. Alright, now that I've reviewed all the studio albums for PARADINAS, it's finally time to talk about a whole bunch of his various other releases on the side, be it EPs, side albums and archive comps, projects under other aliases other than µ-Ziq, and collaboration projects as well, and there is so much to talk about here. PARADINAS has released a ridiculous amount of music outside of just his main albums. I mean, I'll admit, there was even a part of me who wanted to skip over this video altogether when I started up this series, just because it was such an intimidating prospect with such a crazy amount of work required. And odds and ends videos rarely perform that well in the algorithm. But the rest of this discography review has been markedly more successful than I expected it to be when it started, and a lot of people have expressed interest in all sorts of random projects he's released that aren't just his main albums, so it became clear this was kind of necessary to do. Now, this video is by no means going to be comprehensive. There's a lot of random stuff I'm not going to be covering here. Just for example, in 2015 he dumped like 50 billion random tracks onto his SoundCloud page, most of which aren't available there anymore. I'm obviously not going to talk about those. There are EPs like My Little Beautiful and Brace Yourself, which I've already talked about thanks to their being repackaged in the recent Lunatic Harness reissue that I went over when I reviewed that album. I'm also not going to be talking about the album he did in collaboration with Mrs. Jinx in 2021 called Secret Garden, because I already did a Some Stuff I Missed segment on it around the time that came out. I'll link that segment in the description, or put a card up there if you want to. That album has admittedly shrunk on me a bit since it came out, after Magic Pony Ride and 1977 did some related ideas better, but I still view that as a solid effort. And there's plenty of other stuff that this video will not be covering, for no particular reason other than the fact that this video took so freaking much work to put together already. This video was all but guaranteed to burn me out on his work, and it did. So if there were some random loose 2-track things or promo singles with a couple of B-sides that didn't seem that notable and I could cut to save me a little bit of effort, I did cut them. So apologies if you were really itching for me to talk about something like Further Electronics Tracks or Diesel M. Even with all that in mind, we got dozens of releases to go through today. This guy's got enough random side releases to fill up his own Some Stuff I Missed roundup, so let's not waste any more time and just get into it. So, we're going to be starting off in a bit of a weird spot that ordinarily I probably wouldn't have gone into, but one that a handful of people have specifically requested for me to talk about. Technically, the first EP released under the µ-Ziq name was the Auteurs vs. µ-Ziq from 1994. Or µ-Ziq versus the Auteurs, if you like. It's a collection of 6 remixes of tracks from the 90s alt-rock band The Auteurs' then recent album Now I'm a Cowboy. I haven't heard that album this EP is based on in full, outside of a few small previews of the tracks he remixed. It seemed to confirm that probably wasn't going to be my thing all that much. But this EP did get a lot of attention and is considered a semi-important part of PARADINAS' catalog that a lot of people remember fondly. It was considered notable enough that I even heard it back when I first did my first marathon of all the µ-Ziq albums around 2015, even though I'd never kept it around or came back to it. And hey, coming back to it, I cannot deny it is an interesting little project that you're not going to get anything like elsewhere. Though I'm still not sure how essential I'd say this really is. I mean, it is neat to hear PARADINAS chopping up these rock songs and using them as basically like instrumental hip-hop samples to go over his then standard blend of distorted drum machines. And it all makes for a decently fun experience. I just don't know if I'd have that much notable to say about it outside of that. I guess the best track was probably Daughter of a Child. The way it looped the sample did have that sort of old-school hip-hop flavor. I guess you could get some decent atmospheric bangers out of Chinese Bakery and Underground Movies. Lenny Valentino number 1 was a nice and expansive 12-minute arrangement, and number 2 had some nice hypnotic keyboard loops. And the way it opens up with a particularly abrasive Lenny Valentino number 3, it wasn't really to my taste, but I suppose could be other people's cup of tea, I don't know. But this EP just kind of ran together for me more than anything, and didn't really feel like it was giving me that much to work with. Sure, it has a cool out-of-the-box idea to start with, and it's all nice enough while it's on, but outside of its initial novelty, I find it admittedly kind of forgettable. And I still don't see myself coming back to it, which leads me to feel like a 6.7 out of 10 on it. Though next on the list of EPs is possibly a bit more famous one. Around the time of his Impine Effect album, he put out a fully original EP called Salsa With Mesquite. And this one, even if containing some of his most intensely abrasive work, I would say is in fact worth checking out, and much more on par with the other work he was putting out in this era. Pretty much any of this was good enough to have made the cut for Impine Effect in its own right. The title track can be a little bit of a headache, with all its intense distorted beats, super loud high-pitched blips, and other sounds flying around, but there is quite a lot of progression over its 7.5 minutes. Happy and reflective, take plenty of cheerful melodies and layer them over some progressively distorted beats that wouldn't have been out of place on Tango Invective. The latter has some synths that sound like guitar soloing, and that's pretty kick-ass. Loam and Leonard take some very similar beat patterns with some much more dissonant and disorienting melodies on top. And Balsa Lightning evolves from a beatless mix of dark, bassy piano stabs, fades and acid synths, and eventually layers in more shuffling beats. Also, there's a Jake Slazenger remix of this track, which might be even better. Basically takes all the same elements and puts them in a slightly more accessible context, with the percussion reorganized into more of a hip-hop beat and the melodies all staying pretty upfront from the get-go. We'll get more into Jake Slazenger later in this video. But yeah, this whole EP is really solid. I had a lot of fun with it, and it just recently hit streaming services alongside Impine Effect, so make sure to check it out if you like that album. I could give this a 7.7 out of 10. And speaking of previously unavailable projects that recently hit streaming services this year, a few months before Lunatic Harness came out, he put out a pair of EPs called Urmur Bile Trax Volume 1 and 2, also compiled together in a single 8-track package, which runs on for over an hour. These tracks are all quite long, running on anywhere from 6 to 12 minutes each. But it's all plenty of fun. This was one of his first proper forays into the whole drill and bass sound. And features more jazzy sampling than you'd expect, going over the frantic breaks you would expect. Basically, if you're a fan of something like Plug's Drum and Bass for Papa, you'll like this too. And I enjoy this on about the same level as that project, which is to say, I'm not absolutely in love with it, and some of it can drag on a bit much for my liking, but I can certainly respect all of it for what it is. The strongest tracks are by far the first two, the sort of title track, which absolutely goes hard and has a ton of visceral punch as you'd want out of this kind of drum and bass mix, and the quirkier tones of Let, which has all these random squeaky sound effects going over some airy pads from jazz samples. Those are really fun. The rest can land a bit on the dry side for my liking, though I also think the Hydro Zone has a lot of nice round and mildly funky bass lines, and there's also some interesting reworks of his old tracks, Phi 1700 and the Sonic Fox, repurposed into One Hip 007 and the Phonic Sox, respectively. Though other tracks like Hornet and Fine Tuning just kind of fell in the background and meandered on. Overall, this is still enough of a fun time for me to let it get away with a solid 7 out of 10. I just don't think it's the most essential of releases on display here. Though while we're on the topic of very standard old school drum and bass, in 2005 he put out a little EP called Ease Up, which I thought was also quite fun and enjoyable enough to be worth mentioning. Also, it's one of the few things he released in that era, around the mid through later 2000s, where he released things the least frequently. The main title track here is pretty standard fare as far as this genre goes, hitting you with lots of the usual standard breaks and dubby vocal samples, eventually switching over into more of like a hardcore section at the end with a really distorted kick. Plenty of fun. And the second track, Wurgle the Proud, is alright enough too, with some fine enough cheerful melodies and breakbeats that don't really stick with me. Though pretty much everyone seems to agree that the reason to check out this EP is the 12-minute VIP version of the title track, and yeah, the hype for that one is real. Expanding that track out to this big unnerving breakbeat epic with all sorts of different layers and progressions going on, it's like its own EP unto itself. I don't think there's enough here for me to give this a score, but it's worth hearing. Skipping ahead a decade, let's move on to 2013 and 2014. In the wake of his Chewed Corners album, he released a handful of companion EPs to add on to that one. In 2013 we got XTEP, and in 2014 we got Rediffusion, also a Rediffusion mixtape on the side that mixed up material from both and some other various related projects. But those two EPs were also combined together into a compilation album called XTLP in 2015. And if that project rings a bell, it's because I included it as an honorable mention when I made my first ever year-end list on this channel in 2015. And it was entirely there because I wanted an excuse to shout out Mike-Paradinas at all. This channel had been going on for less than a year, and I just wanted to shout out artists that I never saw anyone else highlighting at the time. I'd also marathoned his catalog for the first time earlier in the year and was high off of becoming a new fan of his. I hadn't actually figured out that this was technically just a comp of already released EPs to add onto Chewed Corners and not a real new mainline album, and as a result I took it off the list when I redid it retrospectively for a subscriber milestone. Though make no mistake, this project is still absolutely worth hearing and a worthy companion to all the bright melodic quality that Chewed Corners delivered. Coming back to it reminded me exactly why 2015 me wanted to go out of his way to shout it out, because this project might actually be great. I already remembered it having a fantastic opener with XT. It's one of those classic keep adding on new ideas every few measures kinds of tracks he always does so well, building up from cheerful but mildly melancholy piano chords and synth trumpets, adding spacey synth arpeggios and 80s guitar plucks, thick grooving bass lines, chopped up percussion that I remember from like a stock GarageBand loop, and more, just continuing to deliver such an effortless burst of joy. It might actually go toe-to-toe with some of his best tracks ever. But even if that was the only track I really remembered longer term, there's plenty more quality where that came from that I'd completely forgotten about. Be it the bright and sunny 90s house pianos and uplifting synth strings of rhythm, the layers of expansive and colorful synth washes going over old school breakbeats on Taxi Sadness, the absolutely huge sounding imposing wall of melodic pads and slapping percussion on Monge 2 that seems to tower over you, and the similarly impressive rumbling bass lines and crashing 808s on Forger, the more delicate and quirky synths and pianos taking a comparatively more minimalistic tone on New Bimple, the chilled out cloud of uplifting synth organs and choirs on Remy, or the tasty acid arpeggios blasting through Pulsar. And sure, there are a handful of tracks that feel like they could just be filler left over from Chewed Corners like Smeester or Tambor or Blim, but these are just as solid tracks as those that actually did make the cut on the main album like Tycon or Twangle Melkas. Yeah, in a lot of ways XTLP may basically just be more Chewed Corners, and it doesn't have like a weakling PARADINAS level knockout track, but it's almost equally as good as the main album as a whole. This stuff doesn't just feel like B-sides to that album. They're all just as well polished and high quality with ideas that can stick with you just as much. And it even runs together less than Chewed Corners did. If you didn't like that project's brighter melodic approach, I guess you might be able to skip this, but if you like one of these albums, you'll like the other. I gave Chewed Corners an 8.3, but this companion gave me enough to get away with a solid 8. But speaking of double EPs that add more of the same experience onto a main µ-Ziq album with comparable quality, we just got that again last year, didn't we? As companions to his Magic Pony Ride album in 2022, there was the Goodbye EP, which came before it, and the Hello mini album, which came after it, added together for an exclusive CD-only compilation called Hello Goodbye. I'll admit I don't find these companion projects as exciting as the stuff on XTLP. I felt like that project did a bit more work to set itself apart from the main album, while Hello and Goodbye are basically just more Magic Pony Ride with not much in the way of other surprises. And even if I do love the main album, it was already a very samey sounding project that didn't exactly leave me wanting any more of it than what it already had. But I suppose I'll still take this stuff for what it is, and you know, to their credit, even if these projects are made up out of all the exact same sounds as Magic Pony Ride, they do have a number of ideas that the main album didn't explore, with an occasional tendency to end up in darker and more dissonant territory. I listened to these in the order that they appeared on that CD comp, and, well, okay, Hello starts with 3 tracks that are almost literally just alternate versions of tracks from the main album. The title track mirrors Goodbye, taking the same icy pianos and airy vocal stabs and giving them new melodies and a slightly more driving bass line. Iggy's song mirrors Elka song by sampling his then 6-year-old son's voice, although repurposing it into a much more abrasive Amen break workout. And Magic Pony Ride Part 3, I mean, it is exactly what it says on the tin. But you do also get tracks like Green Chaos, which has all these samples from old school house divas as a nod to RP Boo that really sticks out. You get a big 7-minute cut in Pyramidal Mind Dispersion, which has a lot of these sped up house percussion patterns and some ambient side tracks. You get a hard-hitting bassy breakbeat workout that leans away from the melodies and modulating angels, and you got some tracks that have markedly more disorienting melodies like Pentagonal Antiprism or the closer Meta by Diminished Icosahedron. The latter, aside from its mouthful of a title, has some synth organs in it that sound like they could be making a nod to, like, Square Pusher's Eufabulum. And across from that, there's also the Goodbye EP, which has its own set of tracks. The CD comp has a more skittering and complex Goodbye VIP to replace the title track, which also shows up on a different EP for Goodbye remixes. But the remaining tracks on the EP are all quite nice. Giddy All Over might have an even better tune than the title track and seems to be the big fan favorite. It's deserved. Moise has some trap beats and wiry leads that make it sound closer to the Chewed Corner sound. And then all bets are off for the end of the EP with Rave Whistle and its 2 alternate remixes. The original version and the Dark Side mix can get a bit repetitive and annoying, though the Jungle Techno remix does take a pretty unique blend of retro 90s sounds that somehow takes from totally different sides of that retro 90s sound than any of the other stuff he put out for this album cycle. I'll admit I struggle to say this stuff is absolutely essential listening or anything I feel compelled to keep around. The melodies on the main Magic Pony Ride album have just stuck with me a lot more in such a way that makes it hard for this stuff to compete with it. But is there stuff worth hearing here that still left me glad I sat down with it? Yeah, sure. If I had to score the collective of Hello and Goodbye as shown on that CD, it'd be like a 7.3 out of 10. So now we're through the EPs and companion projects that directly add on to other albums, but one particular thing to note about the µ-Ziq catalog, especially as of the last decade or so, is that Mike PARADINAS has been known to release absolute boatloads of archival material and leftover tracks that he made in the 90s which never got released onto his main albums. I already reviewed one such archival album when he put out Challenge Me Foolish in 2018 as a direct companion to his Royal Astronomy album, but boy is there plenty more where that came from. In 2013, he released a massive double CD compilation called Somerset Avenue Trax, which has material made anywhere from 1992 to 1995, in the days of his first 2 albums. This one in particular gets a lot of buzz from fans. Even if the stuff here obviously isn't going to be as good as the stuff that actually did make the cut for Tango, Invective, and Bluff Limbo, it is hard to go wrong with this particular early era of PARADINAS. Though this is also a 2-hour compilation with 24 tracks, and I really don't feel like going through every single one of them, so I'll just highlight a handful of my favorites. The best track here was probably Vinxel, which hits you with airy melodies going over to sort of disco percussion over an epic 7-minute arrangement. Spooky Tooth has all these really cool MIDI flute sounds running through its comparatively more chill mixes. Pollux has some really disorienting wobbling bass lines, but also a lot of nice and playful MIDI pianos and bells that add up to its cheerful beatless vibes. And I suppose Toss could make for a nice companion to that track with its similarly cheerful piano chords adding on to thicker beat work. Air 2 mostly sticks to the more dissonant and less melodic side of the sound, but makes remarkable use of its 7.5 minutes by seemingly throwing a new change-up or progression at you every 10 seconds. Green Lanes is another one of those classic keep piling on new layers until it's a total chaotic clusterfuck type of track. Boistrin and Pock hit you with lots of really nice intense acid synths of differing textures. Victor's Mark had some kind of neat Asian harp melodies. The percussion and patterns on sync kind of remind me of Monolake. And Ropt and O have lots of nice downtempo ambience, with the former adding on some bongo tapping. Not to say it's all good. The worst track was STR06. That one has several different creepy melodic layers that seem to openly clash with each other in a really unpleasant way. Johnson's QFab was pretty boring. The closer Melodion struck me as overly cheerful to the point of cheesiness. Most of the second disc kind of just fell in the background for me without me remembering much of it. And I'm not sure whether Toy Gun number 2 is a highlight or a low light. It's basically Mr. Angry without the screaming baby noise, so a massive improvement on that track, if still not one I see myself coming back to. I can't bring myself to say I see myself keeping any of this comp around longer term, just because the stuff that actually made the cut for his first 2 albums obviously delivered the same ideas done even better. But the vast majority of this is still solid for what it is and shows that even the leftovers he had from this era had a lot of quality worth hearing. It's probably not a must listen if you're not already a diehard fan, but if you are, this will be a real treasure trove. And I think I got just enough enjoyment out of it to let it get away with a 7.5 out of 10. Next up in 2016, he put out 2 more archival comps. First there was Aberystwyth Marine. a scattered collection of material he made from 1986 to 1998 in between the Lunatic Harness and Royal Astronomy eras. A couple of tracks here even made the cut for some of Lunatic Harness's supplementary material. Hanky Pokery and Jiggery Panky from the My Little Beautiful EP made it here, as did the cut of My Jib, which ended up as a bonus track on Lunatic Harness's anniversary reissue. Now, I distinctly remember both of the 2016 comps being pretty disappointing when I first heard them and burning me out on PARADINAS' style every time I've ever tried putting them on. They were honestly the main reason I was dreading getting to this video, and I had even considered skipping covering them as a result. Though I threw them in this video anyway, since I'd seen people specifically interested in hearing my thoughts on them, and I did technically include them when I did an in brief segment on this guy for my Challenge Me Foolish review. Coming back to re-listen to this album now, I mean, I do get why it still has its fans, but I remain pretty ambivalent on it myself. As far as I'm concerned, this is pretty much just a collection of stuff that sounds like Lunatic Harness, but markedly worse and less memorable. Not to say there isn't still some quality here. I guess tracks like Fucked Off Again and Unbutton My Coat go decently hard and have lots of complex breakbeat workouts. Tracks like Patronus, Hard Step, Tosser, and the above-mentioned The Cut of My Jib have plenty of solid and playful melodies. The latter is almost certainly the best track in the bunch. To the Light is a kind of alright bass, synth-heavy trip-hop cut with some vocoder vocal hooks that aren't too bad. Millennium Hand and Shrimp combines excessively clipping and distorted percussion that smash you in the face with lots of tense and dissonant string melodies, kind of more in the Royal Astronomy style. And Air 3 and Yum are serviceable enough, if somewhat oily, little low-key ambient excursions. But there's some pretty rough stuff here too. There's another attempt at some vocoder-driven synth-pop breakbeat cut in Die Tomorrow that just did not work at all, and came off a lot more unpleasant and incoherent than To the Light despite its more energetic sound. Ice 9 Part 2 has some visceral, distorted percussion, but also a lot of unpleasant acid synths that feel like they're being played at complete random. I already mentioned not having strong feelings on Hanky Pokery or Jiggery Panky when I talked about them in my Lunatic Harness review. I suppose they're a bit better in this context, with the former's buzzing bass sounding more like an actual hook compared to its surrounding tracks, and the latter having a bit more visceral punch to its breakbeats, though I don't know if that's actually a good sign for the level of quality this album operates on, given they were some of my least favorite bonus tracks on the Lunatic Harness reissue. There's also You Could Smell It, this album's equivalent to Wannabe, featuring some really annoying repeated vocal samples going over more oily and unpleasant ambience. And the album has a pretty rough closer and Plinky Plonky as well, with lots of chopped up, pitched down samples that almost sound like someone burping going up next to all these excessively squeaky and high-pitched melodies that get on my nerves more than anything. I mean, look, not to shit on this album too much, I don't hate it by any means. It's perfectly alright and competently made. The material on display has enough complexity and solid melodic instincts even in its weakest moments where I can see why people still really like it. Especially the people who stand so heavily behind Lunatic Harness being his best work, but man, on a personal level, I just do not find this to be a fun listen. It's all ideas he's done better elsewhere that are a lot more likely to fall in the background and lose my attention. It feels like the generic average of the sounds he's best known for with none of his best tracks. A lot of people really love this one, so you may still want to give it a shot. I appear to be heavily in the minority with my take on it, but if you ask me, this is mostly an essential. It kind of drags on and doesn't come particularly close to the quality he can deliver on any of his actual mainline albums. I'm feeling like a 5.7 out of 10 on this at my most generous. The other archive project he put out in 2016 was RY30 Trax, a lost album he made in 1995 while working on some material under the Jake Slazenger name. Again, we'll get to that later. It was originally designed to be contained together in the exact same way it was presented here, but just got shelved without seeing a release until over 20 years later. And just like Aberystwyth Marine, it definitely still has its fans, but also just like that album, I'm not one of said fans. In fact, I hate to say it, but I think this one was even worse. Again, it's not terrible or unlistenable by any stretch. It might technically be a bit more consistent, but man, this strikes me as a remarkably drab listen, and so many of these cuts feel so lifeless and bland by his standards. There's a few alright isolated standouts. I suppose I can get behind the skipping bass synths and various evolutions running through the near 9-minute opener Μ-Ziq. The sleepy, mildly miserable, and disorienting piano progressions on Me and My Hoss were relatively charming for what they were. And the brighter melodies and more skittering beats of Bomba Dub allowed for a much more strikingly energetic mix than pretty much anything the rest of the album explored. As did the crashing breaks and higher-pitched melodic cascades on Adenoidal. And I guess maybe tracks like Rydino and Smooth and Creamy could have a few nice, pleasantly melancholic melodies as well, even if they're still not exactly so great. I want to go out of my way for them. And the latter ends in a bit of an unnecessary jump scare. But man, the rest of this was a snooze fest. Be it mildly quirky sketches such as Jazz Norton, Rubbish and Crumbs, or Mysopal that just never really go anywhere interesting. Unpleasant clouds of generic, mildly abstract ambient techno like Fortuna or Sinusoidal. The former of those, I guess, has some cool Royal Astronomy strings, but it's still just so slow and dragging and not very fun, and the latter is just pure incoherent blah that might be the worst track here. There's mildly creepy, if unassuming ambience like Cumberland that eventually ends in the beatbox sampling from the track Lunatic Harness, which ends up feeling like a bit of a cheap callback. There's sleepy instrumental hip-hop like Lime Crumble featuring some okay string pads and percussion that can sometimes sound like banging on cans. And there's also the track Dust Star 3, which had a somewhat unique idea on paper with all these plucked sitar melodies, but in practice those sitars end up just getting annoyingly high-pitched and grate on my nerves. I really hate to say it, but this project's just a chore to get through. It doesn't have anywhere near the energy or color to work in the same way as his classics from this era, but it isn't moody, atmospheric, or emotionally resonant enough to work in a miserable on purpose way that the darkest moments of his earlier albums, or something like Duntus Born Abbots, can. It's just an hour of low-stakes, inessential, middle-of-the-road 90s IDM sludge. Again, I do appear to be in the minority of people who don't care for this. It was all around well received at the time, but all the most positive reviews I've seen of it just seem to be like happy to hear something that sounds like it was produced in 1995. And if that's your bar, I feel like there's lots better µ-Paradinas material from that era that you could pick up instead, and we'll get to plenty more of that later on. I mean, good on you if you still did really find standout quality in these projects. I kind of wish I could see what those people saw in it beyond the surface level nostalgia for this style. But if I counted all of the archival material albums like these as main music albums, RY30 Trax would sadly rank in dead last as my least favorite album of his, and I'm overall feeling a 5.3 out of 10 on it. At the very least, that's the lowest I'm gonna score any project in this video. And on top of archival albums and comps like those, he also had a couple of archival EPs too. For instance, in 2017, we got the Pthagonal EP, containing 4 more unreleased tracks that he originally made in that early era from 92 to 95. And this stuff I actually did really like. You got PC5, a track where he pretty much just jams with his keyboard over one of the drum machine beats that I think was on Tango Invective. You also got Antiphon, which takes on more of like a squirty ambient direction that weirdly reminds me of some old early Boards of Canada demos. Both of those tracks are solid. The reason I was intrigued enough in this EP to add it on here was Original Fiesope, a 9-minute demo that would eventually turn into the track we know from In Pine Effect. And also one that really sheds light onto its title as it takes the beat from his track Phi 1700 and slows it down while putting the same xylophone melodies on top. The track does admittedly feel a bit empty without the guitar samples, but it still adds up to a fittingly nice vibe that's much more moody than the track that it would eventually turn into. But the actual best moment here then, the main reason to check out this EP, is the track Olay, which takes all these marching beats and builds some surprisingly strong melodies out of various pads and MIDI guitar plucking. Actually, it's a pretty strong emotional note. Is this EP a must-listen? Probably not, but it's still a fun time. The other archival EP I felt like highlighting was the D-Funk EP from 2018, another selection of 4 unreleased tracks from 1995 and 96 that he put out on the Analogical Force label, right before the guys running said label convinced him to properly return to the studio and put out his Skirlage album a few years later. Though honestly, if you hadn't told me this was archival material, I could have believed this stuff was new. It has a sound to it that doesn't just sound like a runoff of some other album of his. There's a lot of sleek and metallic drum machine textures going up next to dramatic synth strings, and they all sound surprisingly well polished. Granted, I wouldn't say it's astonishingly memorable either, but once again, it is nice, and it's cool to hear these compositions that do feel interestingly darker and higher stakes than some of the stuff he was actually releasing around that time. My favorite track here is the first one, Drokovums, which has all these electro beat patterns going up next to string pads that sound like they could fit in like a sci-fi movie or something. Though the title track goes particularly hard with all its blasts of dissonant synths and distorted bass, the 10-string melodies on Brittle are mildly catchy, and the whooshing beats and harshly screeching chord stabs going over some old orchestral sample on Tricolor is pretty cool sounding too. Once again, it's a fun time. Now, that's going to be it as far as material that PARADINAS released under the µ-Ziq name, but we're obviously not even close to covering everything. If you look at the top of his Bandcamp page, you'll see the names of a whole bunch of other aliases he's released under. Tusken Raiders, Jake Slazenger, Kid Spatula, Frost Jockey, Rude Ass Tinker, and Gary Moshles. We're gonna have to talk about all of those, except for Rude Ass Tinker. He only released one single under that name and was only using it thanks to being almost sued by Lucasfilm for using the name Tusken Raiders, and I kinda already touched on that single when I reviewed Bilious Paths. But what about the stuff he actually released under the Tusken Raiders name? Well, there's a lot to go through where that came from, mostly stuff he's released over the past couple of years, after the legal situation around the name Tusken Raiders changed and he could release under it again without worrying about getting sued. There's two main series of EPs that have been running under the Tusken Raiders name. First, there's the series of 4 Bantha Trax EPs, all released a decent bit apart from each other. The first one came out in 1995, the second in 1999, then a big gap before the third and fourth came out in 2020 and 2022 respectively. Now I'm not going to break down every track in this series because, again, I don't feel like keeping people too long, and I also suspect this is the point at which fewer people are going to be watching or curious to hear about what I have to say. But, I mean, these EPs are good if you want a lot of percussive bangers that maybe don't lean as strongly on the melodies. Just aiming for pure visceral punch and not much else. The first EP is decently well varied, with tracks ranging from tribal-flavored breakbeat to distortion-heavy electro. Its biggest highlights are the 2 8-minute cuts, which fall more under the former category in Tatooine Sunset and Sexy Sand People. Both have some pretty unique-sounding organic grooves that don't sound like anything else I've heard in the PARADINAS catalog up to this point, and a nice little sense of progression with very light xylophonish melodies fading in near the end of both. The second volume is all pure drum and bass breakbeat bangers with blaring acid synths. Not a lot to specifically differentiate between the 4 tracks on there, but they do all equally go satisfyingly hard. The third volume picks up right where the second one left off. Fittingly, the material on there was actually originally made around the same time as the second one, around 1998-99. It's twice as long as the second EP with 8 tracks instead of 4, though it's pretty much all the exact same deal. Lots of skittering and crashing drum and bass breaks with lots of abrasively squelching acid. Aside from the last 2 tracks, Generate Tusks and Fessio, which are more like thumping and squelching techno tracks with a bit of an electro flavor in some parts. Basically, if you've heard the motorbike track from Royal Astronomy and imagine it without the Gangstar samples, you've heard the kind of sound that pretty much everything on Volume 2 and 3 of these series brings to the table. Fitting enough, since the motorbike track was originally released under the Tusken Raiders name right around the same time they were made. Though Volume 4 is brand new material from last year, and even if I probably enjoyed it about the same amount as all the others, it's an entirely different beast from the previous 3. There's a lot more of an ambient melodic approach to the tracks on here, either combined with squelchy abstract techno or straightforward old-school retro acid on tracks like Bantha Crunch and Tusken Acid, respectively, or taking on a more airy beatless texture with piano accompaniment or formless amelodic abstraction on tracks like Jundland Wastes or Alien Appendages. Even ends with a mysterious downtempo track called Polygon C as a really obvious Aphex Twin nod. It does feel pretty out of place next to the rest of the series, but I suppose adding in some more variety like that doesn't hurt. And overall, I mean, I get why this material isn't really talked about much, but that's not because there's a lack of quality here. It's more just a lack of interesting things to say, I guess. None of these EPs are essential listening by any stretch, but I did enjoy myself all the way through all 4 of them, so they're all out there if you're curious. The whole collective series all averages out to me feeling like a solid 7 out of 10. But the Bantha Trax EPs aren't even the biggest story for the Tusken Raiders alias. Throughout the course of 2021, with one extra installment near the end of last year, he put out an even bigger series of EPs called Housewerk, which currently has 7 volumes. All of these EPs were made very quickly, a few were only put together over like the course of a week. And they all aim to capture PARADINAS' memories of like late 80s and very early 90s dance music pioneers, from like Mr. Fingers and the Dawn of Deep House and Acid House to Model 500 and the other Detroit techno legends, among other things. I don't have a lot of detailed thoughts on these, so I'm just gonna blaze through them. The first volume runs through a couple of standard abstract Acid House cuts before culminating in the especially pretty House 11, which surrounds its old school house beats with comforting airy pads and MIDI harps. Volume 2 focuses more on the melodic sound of the latter track, and especially with the track Amnesia, assumingly directly named after the Mr. Fingers album. And although House 12 was disappointingly not that memorable compared to the other House tracks I've heard, it's made up for by Jauntasm, which has some fantastically playful edges to its melodies and chord stabs. Really nice mood lifter there. Also, the artwork on that volume was drawn by his above-mentioned then 5-year-old son, Inigo, which is kinda cute. Volume 3 is mostly made out of more melodic reworks of tracks from Volume 1, but is mostly worth hearing for the track Satisfaction Dub, which has lots of tasty 90s house pianos and a couple of really nice punchy soul samples to boot. Volume 4 has another mix of acid bangers and melodic deep house, with cuts in the latter department standing out to me more again, especially 100 Stories High and Quartifugal Rainbows. Volume 5 was purported to have more bleep and bass influences, and mostly didn't leave that strong an impression on me, though I did quite enjoy the round bouncing grooves of Bubble Funk and the buzzing off-kilter bass stabs and skittering beats of Rhino. Volume 6 was mostly made out of just alternate versions of cuts elsewhere in the series that aren't as good. Honestly, don't have anything special to note about that one. If the whole series were gathered together, this volume would feel like bonus tracks. Also, the original version of Satisfaction on here was unfortunately a lot more grating than the dub version on Volume 3. Though if that made for a disappointing ending, he delivered a much stronger ending with the Bandcamp exclusive Volume 7. There's another solid melodic deep house cut in Rainbow Child, a crunchy breakbeat cut I really liked with Cassid, and a really off-kilter and strange cut to cap the whole series off with Mistaka. That volume might actually be the best out of all of them. Obviously, not everything in the Housewerk series is solid gold, and I kinda doubt you're gonna find anything that'll really change your life, but all of it was consistently fun to listen to, and there might even be a potentially great album if I just took my favorite tracks from the series or something. Even if it's not exactly all gems all the way through, I feel like there's more stuff here that I might find worth keeping than I would have expected. Adding the whole collective series together, I'm feeling like a 7.5 out of 10 on my experience. The last Tusken Raiders thing I want to highlight here is, of course, his debut album under the alias, also from 2021, called Boundary Road. Advertises his attempt at a straightforward techno record, or at least a certain version of techno that radio shows he listened to in the very early 90s defined it as. And yeah, I mean, retro sounds from PARADINAS at this point aren't going to be any surprise, but once again, there is a flavor to this project that none of his other stuff has. It definitely lives up to being one of his most techno releases, and definitely carries a much darker and more foreboding mood than anything he did for the Housewerk EPs. I guess the 2 tracks at the end of Bantha Trax Volume 3 are the closest comparison to what he did here. Basically, this is a project notable for how much it leans away from melody. There's very little of that, and what little there is very understated and as intentionally gray and colorless as that album cover. Not unlike the darkest and most metallic moments of Tango Invective, except a lot better polished production-wise. You'll get claustrophobic, acid-centric club bangers like Whiplash and Windy Miller and the title track. You'll have thuddingly huge bass surrounding you on Synaptic Pressure, or a few clattering breakbeat fragments cutting through thick dark ambience on 99. Tracks like Traffic Light or Luminaire, which maybe don't make the percussion feel so overbearingly huge but can still feel huge in other ways, like the unnerving pad surrounding the latter, or especially the former cut, which repeats this single filtered synth stab throughout much of it that sounds really cool. And there are a few cuts that do have time for light melodies. The most melodic cut, and incidentally probably my favorite here, was Butterfly, though even this cut through its brighter arpeggios maintains the same metallic atmosphere as everything else thanks to its rumbling bass and additional driving techno beats. Similar deal with the more robotic and rhythmic River Dance that repeats very simple stabbing arpeggios that technically do have a present melody, if a markedly darker one. And it all culminates in the end in an ambient piece called Mogadon that has just as much metallic foreboding, but softened with some wordless female vocals layered on top. The album as a whole is pretty dang neat. While I'm not sure if I enjoyed it so much where I see myself keeping it around longer term, and it definitely has the feel of a side project and a one-off novelty, it doesn't give me anything really to complain about for what it is. Darker techno excursions like these can certainly always have their place, and this is a pretty well realized version of it. Enough so where I can give it a 7.3 out of 10. So that'll be all the Tusken Raiders I felt like highlighting, but next up on the list of side aliases is Jake Slazenger, under which PARADINAS has been about equally active, having released 4 albums and 2 EPs. Now, for the sake of cutting myself a little bit of a break on this video, I'm actually only going to be reviewing his first 2 albums under this alias. I'd planned to cover all 4 of the Jake Slazenger albums in this video, but the 2 that he released in 2020, Drops of Deuce and Ace in the Hole, they're basically just scattershot compilations of leftovers that didn't make the cut for the first 2 albums under this name. And while they're generally fine for what they are, I really struggle to write that much specific about them. Ace in the Hole might be worth checking out if you want to hear a number of tracks that often feel like they're like deconstructing more recognizable classic µ-Ziq tracks and ascribing new melodies to them. It has a decent handful of fun ideas scattered throughout, but it also way overstays its welcome and burned me out on his style. As such, that's all the coverage you're getting from me on those. But anyway, let's get into his debut effort under the Jake Slazenger name in 1995 here, Makesaracket. And right off the bat, there's a pretty different tone to this material than the stuff we've heard from Tusken Raiders. Compared to the generally more serious and straightforward work he's been putting out there, Makesaracket shows him diving headfirst into his goofier side with a percussive electro-funk record. You know how there's a track on Bluff Limbo called Make It Funky? It's that kind of electro-funk. We're not on expert knob twiddler's level of goofy, but there's definitely a much more lighthearted tone to all of this stuff. Right from the second this thing starts, you're hit with the quirkiest of easily whistleable synth melodies with lumbering electro beats on opener megafunk to let you know exactly what you're getting into. And the mildly cheesy bangers sure as hell don't end there, be it the ad-libbing voices on Get Up R going over a set of crushing beats that make it difficult to tell where the downbeat is supposed to be. The playful TV ad background music xylophone sampling going up next to lots of synth trumpets on Gary's birthday. We'll get back to Gary in a little while. There's also the carefree jazzy keyboards going over bouncy downtempo beats on Daytime Kiss, claustrophobic industrial beats and synth stabs going up next to bizarre reversed vocal harmonies on Flawed, or high-pitched whirring melodic licks on funk guitars and Seinfeld slap bass on Bolus, sampled 80s break dance rapping and G-funk whistling on Feet, ridiculously cheery but weirdly wavering synth melodies going over dense IDM percussion on Five Alive. But not everything here is trying to go for tongue-in-cheek silliness like that. There are a number of tracks that go for a much more straightforward approach and oddly try to stick to like an 80s electro kind of sound. Especially when it comes to tracks like Stupid Wanker or Wyatt, or especially the closer Lux, which sounds like it's really trying to pay tribute to the Juan Atkins and Cybotrons of the world. And the bonus tracks also fall on the comparatively more straightforward side, like how Acid Pope is just a no-nonsense crazy... Like how Acid Pope is just a no-nonsense crazy acid banger that just smashes you in the face with acid, or how Spry Bat, I guess, feels like it could be the exact average of all the sounds explored on this album. The album's ending did strike me as a little anticlimax and arbitrary. But yeah, this project definitely has a sound to it that only it has and none of PARADINAS' other projects do. While I liked all this stuff and found all of it very charming, I could also tell it was a side project. He has gone even further with a few of the ideas explored here on his main albums. There's only a couple of tracks I could easily remember after it was done, pretty much all in the first half. I don't know how much I'll end up coming back to it, but at the same time, every time I put it on, it was an all-around delightful time, and I'd put it on like 4 different times. There is something here that elevates it beyond just purely being a side curiosity. Just the kind of relaxed, not really giving a fuck attitude that ends up resulting in a strange mix of influences that feels oddly compelling in a more subtle way than the unsubtlety of the music might have you expecting. And it also probably says something that I never noticed this album was nearly an hour and a half long until seeing how that was how long it was right after writing this review. I would have guessed 55 minutes to an hour at most, and I was never feeling that length. So, I don't know, it's not a masterpiece or anything, but it's definitely fun. I'll give it a 7.5 out of 10. Now, the second Jake Slazenger album from 1997 is an even bigger story because he released it on the one and only Warp Records, his only project to be released on the label if I'm not mistaken. And he gave this album quite possibly the best title of any project he's ever released. Das ist ein Groovybeat, ja. The title really speaks to me as someone who grew up in a primarily German household. So, I was told this project was going to be a bit more chill and down-tempo centric than the first one, and it seems not to get reviewed as well. I've seen comments describing it as background music that would play during lottery drawings on TV in the 70s. which honestly did more for me to look forward to this than not. And I mean, the statement that this album is more down-tempo is technically not inaccurate. It's less percussive or banger-centric as the previous album. It has much fewer straightforward electro bangers and more tracks that focus on the same kind of sound as cuts like Gary's Birthday and end up a little in early Ninja Tune kind of territory. But I probably enjoyed this equally as much as the first album, maybe a tiny bit more. It is definitely a bit of a front-loaded album once again, with my favorite cuts mostly just comprising the entire first half. Going from punchy TV-theme horn sections, going up next to squirting melodies and Phil Collins-esque beatwork on opener Hung Like a Bull, to fluttering jazzy organs and synth blips going over an instrumental hip-hop beat on Superfunk, to minimal percussion and chill electric pianos going up next to several different layers of horns and trumpets on The Big Easy, directly continuing its underlying ideas on Lumpback Raider, featuring less horns but more guiro or vibroslap or whatever that weird percussive noise going on there is. There's a big jump in energy with all the crisp and jangly MIDI percussion going up next to more jazzy keyboards and an occasional buzzing synth every few beats on Nautilus. And then you're hit with one of the best tracks of them all in King of the Beats, which hits you with lots of harsh but playful synth melodies, overbearingly gritty and distorted bass, and that repeating rapped refrain, "King of the Beats gonna rock the place." That sample makes the track for me. It's easily the catchiest cut here. The second half of the album does have more tracks that end up feeling a bit messier and not as pleasantly cheesy. While the lead melody of Grit to It reminds me of Metamatics in an odd way I like, the mix underneath is just kind of a mess of random fuzz and percussion that doesn't complement it as well. And I suppose Hot Fumes is also kind of nice, with its theme from Shaft guitar noodling and spy movie bassline building it into a crashing distorted beat that sounds almost directly copied off the loudest parts of Tango Invective and Bluff Limbo. But meanwhile, the melodies on tracks like Choin or Come On You Slaz get a bit more grating than anything. And the track Sabaf is probably the low point for me. While it undeniably goes hard, blasting you with more acid synths and distorted beats, it got a bit overbearing for my liking. But the album does thankfully have a really strong closer with Slow Dance, the most down-tempo early Ninja Tune-y cut of them all, taking all these heartfelt loops of keyboards and whistling melodies almost pulled out of old tracks of his like Twangle Front going up next to more melancholy trumpets, but also containing several sections where there's these bridges into like a dramatic upwards key change and thicker instrumental hip-hop beats before going back to the mix we started with. Actually, I think that one might be the best track in the bunch. Once again, this album as a whole isn't the most incredible stuff I've ever heard him do, and I suspect it'll at best be the kind of thing I'll need to be in a specific mood for, but it is the kind of listen that's very hard to dislike with how far it leans into its own lighthearted cheesiness, and how weirdly charming it comes off in the process. It's an album that has its own sound you can't get elsewhere, it's all around a lot of fun. I'll give this a slightly stronger 7.5 out of 10. Alright, and that'll be enough the Jake Slazenger that I'll be talking about in this video. So the next side alias to talk about would be Kid Spatula, under which he's released 3 albums. Or maybe Spatula, depending on where you live. I have never heard that pronunciation before. First up in 1995, we got Spatula Freak, and from hearing this, I get the strong impression that this alias isn't designed with any kind of alternate identity in mind beyond being yet another outlet for various leftovers that didn't make the cut for his other projects. I mean, Tusken Raiders may have been more straightforward in his focus on various 90s dance formulas. Jake Slazenger may have been less serious in its focus with more 80s electro and sampled horn sections, but Kid Spatula has no such notable descriptors. This album is stylistically scattershot as they come, and just sounds like a mix of different ideas from a bunch of his other projects with less development. At least it's a mercifully short 50 minutes with only 9 tracks, and I'll say there's 3 isolated tracks on this thing that really stuck out to me as highlights and even possible keepers. I really like Chisholm and how it started out with these really delicate and sparse pianos and then just hit you over the head with his usual distorted beat work. The closer, Not Human, had a lot of really interesting, creepy industrial atmosphere with all these weird metallic sound effects that came together in an oddly compelling way that didn't sound quite like any other track of his. And the best track by far has to be Cough, which combines all these plotting beats with a surprisingly emotionally vulnerable blend of melancholy ambient synth pads. That one's excellent, really got to me. The rest of the album is fine, but inessential. Some nice mild down-tempo melodies on Dance 3, some fun 60s keyboards on the second half of Vampires that take a bit too long to get going, some cool progression on Trunks starting out with some 80s beats involving into Royal Astronomy synth strings. And none of this project was bad either. The worst track is probably Metal Thing number 1, though that's mainly because it's a weaker version of a track on Bluff Limbo that's also inexplicably mixed way louder than all the other tracks on this project for some reason. I mean, the album's cool. I'd sooner come back to this than the 2020 Jake Slazenger archive albums or RY30 Trax or some other projects like that. But outside of a few tracks, I can't imagine I'm going to come back to this. I'm feeling like a 6.7 out of 10 on it. Now, his second album under the Kid Spatula name, Full Sunken Breaks from 2000, is one that I see more praise for on average from both fans and critics, even if, predictably, it isn't talked about much, and the one professional critic I saw covering it, despite really liking it, still called it Royal Astronomy Leftovers. I wasn't sure how promising that was, though after hearing it, I don't fully agree with that sentiment that this material specifically feels like leftovers from Royal Astronomy. That album had a really specific sound to it that this project doesn't have as much, even in spite of a few vocal appearances from Kazumi and a track called Not the Fear. Full Sunken Breaks is basically a collection of 20 fairly simple disconnected vignettes that vary quite a bit in style and energy level. Though despite a lack of an obvious through-line tying any of the tracks together or specific sound I could really describe the album with aside from sounding like other stuff he was doing in the later 90s, it does also weirdly feel much more like a cohesive whole than Spatula Freak did, even if I definitely don't enjoy all 20 tracks equally. None of them feel more important than any other, and that does at least lead to some veneer of consistency. I suppose some highlights include the cheerful synth stabs on Nordy, the visceral distorted breaks of XXX, mysterious planking melodies on Milk Bottle Tops, lighthearted honky-tonk keyboards building into Royal Astronomy strings on Another Fresh Style, melancholy ambience on Snork Maiden and Kaisoap, hyperspeed breakbeat workouts on the title track in Hard Love, and the tracks with Kazumi, honestly none of them were big favorites. Her voice was fine on all of them, but in the case of Jar Jar Binks and Not the Fear, the instrumental underneath her wasn't all that compelling. And in the case of Opener, Dirtwa, I just don't think she fit. That track could have been one of my biggest favorites in its blaring waves of acidish bass and movie soundtrack pads, but when her voice comes in, it's like she's in the wrong key and she feels really out of place on that track. So my actual favorite cut probably turned out to be Dancing Demons, which built a particularly unique, off-kilter but hypnotic sound out of various layers of synth melodies and some noises that sound kind of like guitar riffs. As a whole, Full Sunken Breaks is an alright listen, even if it could fall into the background a bit. It has its share of ideas that connected, even if none of them resonated with me so much where I see myself keeping the album around longer term. I will say Spatula Freak had significantly higher high points, but I guess this one does have a lot more of them, and it feels like it had the same amount of quality spread out a lot more equally over the course of the entire project. So I guess that balances it out to me enjoying it the same amount and feeling a slightly stronger 6.7 out of 10. But finally, the third and most recent album from the Kid Spatula alias is Meast from 2004, and oh my Christ, this is a 2.5 hour double album with 34 tracks. What have I gotten myself into? The good news about this one is that even if this was the Kid Spatula album I was looking forward to the least, for obvious reasons, it actually turned out to be easily my favorite of the three, and it wasn't particularly close. It's exactly as stylistically scattershot as the other two albums under this name, if not even more, but I feel like the average quality of the tracks on display here was significantly higher this time around. There were a lot better melodies to run into, and I even feel like the production was a noticeable step up as well. Now, it's probably not going to surprise anyone that I don't really think this thing justifies its length. At my most generous, this project needed to be maybe half the length that it was, and that would have already made it way better. There is no reason for this to be 2.5 hours besides just being another excuse for PARADINAS to dump out more of his archives. But at the same time, I also didn't come out at the end of the project feeling burnt out, and there is absolutely something to be said for that. There have been several projects I've talked about throughout this video that were significantly shorter but left me a lot more exhausted at the end than this did. So I'll take that as a good sign. Right from the jump, this project just hits you with its best foot forward right away. Opener Housewife is this super hard-hitting and epic electro banger with all these blaring synthleads and fantastic melodic progressions with all these weird phone messages that sound like a dating profile or something. It borders on being like an EDM anthem or something. This track went so hard and got me so much into it, I was almost taken off guard by it, and it's immediately followed by an equally melodically strong, if much more toned down mix of wobbling pads and Schistner's bass flex. You can get some solid grooving hip-hop type cuts like Tugboat, which has a slight bit of a jazzy flavor, but is mainly carried by its subtle but driving bass line, or some crisp and steadily stomping breaks with layers of bright melodies on Local Jogger, or the strange and off-kilter but equally dense arrangements built around these especially esoteric vocal samples on Carrier, or the much more playful melodies going over standard breakbeats on Jackal, maybe an overly blaring mix of buzzing synths on Residue. Those two aren't huge favorites. Or even a solid handful of MIDI synth workouts, obviously left over from the Royal Astronomy era, like Spacious Hallway or Further 2 or Squirms. Or if you want more toned down material, PARADINAS has you covered on that front too. There's plenty of downtempo or even ambient cuts built around simple, subtle keyboard melodies like PV, Bobby, Trike, or Harpsichord. The latter has some more vocals from Kazumi, and even if her voice is much deeper here than any other track I've heard her appear on, she fits very well. There's also the comfortingly airy tunnel of bass synths on Disclosed, and a highly quirky if oddly heartfelt downtempo cut in It Starts With Bongos, which not only lives up to its title, but also has plenty of fun progressions along its length. Though maybe some will notice that I've exclusively been talking about the first disc with all these highlights. The second half from Sad and Solid onwards admittedly didn't grab me nearly as much, and the vast majority of cuts in the second half lean more towards creepier and more metallic excursions that aren't quite as melodically strong as what came before. A lot of it runs together for me, but I suppose there are still some highlights here too. I suppose the mix of Royal Astronomy strings with Amen breaks on Off Lemon are fun. I do quite like the more delicate ambient melodies of Orange Crumble building into something much quirkier later on. There's some nice ambience created by tracks like Peg and Mighty Soft Step, and some brighter, oddly harsher plinking melodies on Buttress. And there are two cuts right at the end that really stuck out to me as big favorites. The clanking and plodding chaos of My Piano and Me ironically features no piano that I could hear, but instead features this especially strange metallic experimental excursion that feels really tense and apocalyptic. It's a very weird track, but still ended up as one of my favorites. And I'll also give the second disc credit for having a much stronger closer than the first disc as well. The first disc's closer, Grand Wash, was an alright slow-building ambient-centric cut that seemed to leave that disc on more of an unresolved cliffhanger. But the entire album closing on the track Broccoli is a much more satisfying way to close out. Just some nice and subtle but emotionally warm keyboard licks going over a skittering downtempo blend of 808s just takes things out on a really comfy and friendly note that just leaves me feeling really nice. But yeah, as a whole, I was pleasantly surprised by Meast. For as massively overstuffed as it is, it kept my attention surprisingly well. It ain't a masterpiece by any stretch, and there's no way I'm keeping around more than half the track listing here, but there is a full album's worth of material that I could genuinely see myself wanting to keep around. If I just keep those 11 cuts, I'd probably end up with something I can enjoy on a similar level to one of his middle-tier albums, like in Pine Effect or Lunatic Harness. And there are lots more good tracks here that track listing wouldn't include. So take that all as you will. I don't know if I'd recommend sitting through the whole thing, but I had a lot more fun with this than I thought I was going to. Enough to let it get away with a 7.5 out of 10. Right, so that will be everything for Kid Spatula. So the next side alias on the list is Frost Jockey. Apparently, PARADINAS set up a whole fake profile for this artist on the Planet Mu website, attributing his work to someone called Chris Morrison, and a lot of people didn't even find out that it was just another side alias the whole time until a few years later. I guess he's pulling a similar move to what Aphex Twin did a few years later with the Tuss, I suppose. But, yeah, thankfully there's not nearly as much to go through with this alias. He only released 2 EPs under the name, Burgundy Trax Volume 1 and 2, both in 2000. And, well, unlike Kid Spatula, Frost Jockey definitely has its own separate recognizable sound that isn't just an outlet for leftovers from other projects. This is some really straightforward, abrasive, old-school techno. Still got a little bit of that usual PARADINAS touch, but he's clearly chasing after the sound of, the beginning of Detroit techno, like early Jeff Mills and Underground Resistance type shit, where you've got, nothing but distorted beat work, a few minimal harsh melodies with maybe some acid for good measure. All synths, no samples or breakbeats, really. Super back to basics, even more back to basics than what he did on Tusken Raiders Boundary Road. And it'll be a nice break for me as well, because I really don't have much of anything to break down here. Pretty much everything on both of these EPs sounds pretty much the same to me in such a way that I won't have much to write about. They're not so samey in such a way where I found it hard to get through or it actively took away from the experience. When it comes to this particular kind of music, you really don't need to sweat over deeper complexity, and he did accomplish what he was going for. I don't think I have any strong preference between the two EPs. The first volume stuck a bit more to PARADINAS' recognizable sonic hallmarks and rhythms, and had a tiny bit more variety with some cuts that stripped their sound down a bit, like Jike and Spittoon, to contrast the rest of the cuts, which were all about going hard. Maybe the track Rockin' Tidy ran on a bit long for my liking and could get a bit dull, but other tracks, especially Lemons and Come the Mighty, really nailed that abrasive, early Detroit techno sound. The second volume is even more faithful to that particular style than the first, maybe combining it with a bit more electro as well. Which I suppose may be a double-edged sword, as I'd be less likely to guess this was Mike PARADINAS if I was given it blind without knowing who made it. I guess it's more beholden to its influences. Though, honestly, in the particular case of my hearing it after all this Mike PARADINAS marathoning, I can't complain about the change of pace from his usual approach. Highlights include Cvex, which really sounds just like something Jeff Mills would do, or Kilopede, which I suppose was the most traditional PARADINAS sounding one, but definitely went hard. And my two biggest favorites were probably Thick Hobie, which had a really nice driving groove that didn't hit you over the head too hard, and Morshex, which had some nice, more toned-down pad progressions. Overall, I'm probably not going to come back to either of these EPs or remember them all that strongly longer term, but I can respect them for what they are. They will definitely find their audience. They are just as visceral as you'd want this kind of stuff to be without requiring much of any brain usage, and I was happy to get the change of pace. I think both EPs could probably get away with a solid 7 out of 10 for me. Okay, we're finally in the home stretch now. We only got one last solo alias to talk about here, and that would be Gary Moschless. And the only thing he's released under this name is one album from 1996 called Shape to Make Your Life Easier. Once again, we got a bit of a new sound for this alias, and with this project we get a solid collection of very jazz-centric deep house. It's not too far away from the kinds of sounds that he was exploring as Jake Slazenger, especially on Dus's signed Groovybeat a few years later. Though I suppose this project is a little more chill and less punchy than that one. Get it? Because you would mosh less to it. But yeah, I probably got the same level of personal enjoyment as that album too. The best part of the album has to be the opening stretch. The first 4 tracks are all deliciously laid-back jazzy bops with loads of vibraphones. Going from the slow building opener Mambo Ramba to the rollicking vibraphone disco of Play It Again Sonny to the fast-paced Mom Blues, which sounds like all the instruments are breaking down in a heap in several different moments, to the breezy and uplifting Plot Thickener. All really freaking nice stuff, had me really pulled in. The album does take a bit of a downturn for me when we hit Surprise Horn Part 2, which focuses on this much goofier sounding trumpet sample that sounds like it's playing on a really crappy cassette tape or something. I wasn't really feeling that one. And most of the rest of the project didn't hit quite the same heights for me as the first 4 tracks, but at least maintained some solid quality along the way. Either with the heavy stomping loops of Funk Yo Ass that slowly get enveloped by a lot of chaotic buzzing synth work, or the breezy foot-tapping grooves of Walk It Like This. There's a crashing interlude of a chopped-up drum solo on Gary's Groove, and then 2 tracks which combine the jazzy house sound with some acid progressions on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 and Johnny Hates Jazz. And then there's a credits track in Goodbye Jazz People, which I actually found to be a highly charming finish. PARADINAS pitches his voice down and puts on a fake American accent like an Elvis impersonation voice or something, while shouting out all the definitely real people he'd likes to thank and his family and his band, and thanking Jake Slazenger and Bradley Strider for inspiration, but also Jesus Christ, our Lord! Also, the jazzy instrumental underneath him is actually one of the best in the bunch. Honestly, this ended up as another big favorite on the album. Oh yeah, and there's also 2 bonus tracks called Gary's House and Gary Goes Wild, which were originally included as like a 7-inch single to go with the album on vinyl. Neither are major favorites, but they do go decently hard for what they're going for. And overall, yeah, this album was a lot of fun. Maybe it could be a bit hit and miss in some spots, and not every track got to me as much as the next, but it is all around a charming little side effort, and just like the first 2 Jake Slazenger albums, I had a fun time soaking up all the tongue-in-cheek cheesiness and the solid grooves they had to back themselves up. I feel like I could get a properly great album if I took my least favorite cuts from the second half of Das Ist ein Groovybeat and replaced them with my favorite tracks from here. I feel like the material from both projects would complement each other well. Though all the same, the album is still plenty of fun in its current form and can also get a 7.5 out of 10 from me. So that's it. I've talked about all the side aliases that are listed in the banner of his Bandcamp page and all the names he's released solo material under. That means we're done, right? Nope. There's a handful of collaboration projects he has under his belt that we need to go over too. though that's going to be a lot quicker. I've already covered Expert Knob Twiddlers from Mike and Rich and Secret Garden with Mrs. Jinx in the past, so we obviously don't need to go through those again. So there's only 2 notable collaborations left to talk about, and I'll start with the more recent one. In 2013, PARADINAS started up a project called Heterotic in collaboration with his significant other, Lara Rix Martin. They released 2 albums and a promotional EP together before Rix Martin would start to focus more on her own solo work as µ-Ziq afterwards. The first album in 2013 is called Love and Devotion, and I suspect for the small handful of people who were paying attention when it first came out, this must have come as a bit of a shock. It's this super airy and pleasant mix of melodic synth pop and deep house that tonally went completely against the stuff PARADINAS was doing before in the 2000s. Listening to this now, this just sounds like a direct prelude to what he did for Shoot Corners and XTLP. Definitely more stripped back than those albums and with more indie pop influences, care of several vocal appearances from the late Nick Talbot of Gravenhurst. But otherwise it sounds just like those projects. Which I obviously can't complain about. I love Shoot Corners and XTLP, and I'm game for more stuff that sounds like that. And while this album is markedly not as good as those projects, this was an all-around really nice listen all the same. I will say this project strikes me as noticeably front-loaded, which is to say the first 2 tracks on this album completely outclass everything that comes afterwards. The opener, Bliss, is nothing short of stunning in all its mixes of absolutely beautiful melodic layering going up next to airy house diva samples. If PARADINAS had decided he wanted to include this on Shoot Corners, it would have been one of the absolute best tracks on that album too, since it really conveys this expansive sense of space that most tracks on that album don't. Rix Martin turned out to be better at esoteric and dreamlike atmosphere building in her work as µ-Ziq. I can hear some echoes of her work here with what she did earlier this year on her Loverboy album. Anyway, the other big standout is of course Blue Lights. This track brings in Nick Talbot's vocals for the first time, and his lilting and delicate voice ends up a perfect match for the sound of the album. He sounds great next to this driving old school deep house instrumental and delivers some really strong hooks too. Those first 2 tracks are amazing. The rest of the album is cool. In general, I suppose I found the remaining vocal tracks surprisingly went over better than the instrumentals. Even if none of Talbot's hooks stick in the head nearly as well, on the remaining cuts he still does sound nice. Going up next to slower and more stripped back instrumentals like on Wartime and Devotion, and the slow build over the course of 7 minutes on Slumber is nice too. The remaining instrumentals, though, feel a bit barren and undercooked in comparison with the rest. Robocorp is a forgettable interlude, Fanfare makes for a bit of an odd closer to the project, and the synth horns going over the 808 heavy almost trap beats feel a bit out of place in comparison with the rest of the project. And Nell is better than those 2, with some cool minimal house piano progressions and a weird change up into like some rock instrumental right at the end, though it's still not even close to hitting the same heights as those first 2 cuts. So that leaves me in a bit of an odd place with how I feel in the album as a whole. Like, again, first 2 tracks are fantastic, like in the high 8 out of 10 range, and the remaining 6 are enjoyable if not especially memorable, like in the higher 6 range. So I guess that averages out to me feeling like a 7.3 out of 10 on the whole package. It's not as good as it could be, but it does have those 2 high points I'd want to keep around. Now, as for the second Heterotic album that showed up a year later in 2014, I was hoping this would be stronger. It certainly looked like a more fleshed out experience with 12 tracks this time around instead of just 8. And yeah, it is definitely stronger and better fleshed out and more consistent as a complete whole. Heterotic does have more of a developed sound here outside of just sounding like another PARADINAS side project. Though it does lack the soaring heights of the first one. It's the same lateral move from the first Kid Spatula album with the second. Higher floor, lower ceiling. There's also a change in guest singer. Gravenhurst is replaced with Matthew Lebert, aka Vézelay, on this album. He's got a slightly different, more like Grey Reverend or Caribou-ish tone to his singing, I guess. He sounds like the kind of singer you'd hear show up on a more recent Bonobo record. And, I mean, he's fine. He fits well over these instrumentals too, though this particular brand of falsetto indie singing tends not to be my thing. Maybe he'll click more for other people, but his vocals were definitely a step down from Talbot's, and I did get sick of his presence over the course of the album. Though honestly, if it weren't for Vézelay's vocals being less to my taste, this album would probably be an all-around improvement from the first. If it were all instrumental, I would probably like it a lot more. I mean, a lot of the vocal tracks live or die on the instrumentals that Rix Martin and PARADINAS provide, and there are a couple in a row from, like, Triumph, Florence, and Shoe Soul, that ended up kind of grating on my nerves a bit more. I guess Triumph was one of the catchiest tracks here, but also kind of dragged. Damn it. boxes I could take or leave as well, but the remaining vocal tracks were at least nice. The most popular single is Rain, probably because it was the one with the above-mentioned promotional EP backing it. It is a nice atmospheric cut, if not that strong a tune. I like Lumber, that has a way more esoteric and organic instrumental with all this rumbling bass and tambourines and 808s that gets it to stand out more. And easily the best vocal cut was the closer Empires, which had this particular triumphant 80s synth-pop ballad feel to it, and probably the best tune in the bunch. And it's obviously not even to get into the actual instrumental cuts on this thing, which I enjoyed a lot more on average. Be it the Giorgio Moroder-esque opener Self-Importance, which takes all these I Feel Love style synth arpeggios on top of brittle drum machines and creates an especially triumphant and epic tone setter. Penultimate track, Amniotic, takes the trap beats and bright melodies from the Two Corners style, but adds in all these 80s keyboards and guitars in the background to further the retro synth pop atmosphere they're going for. And my favorite cut was probably Sultana, which felt a little more 70s or maybe even 60s inspired to me compositionally in its mix of shuffling acoustic beats and more Rhodes pianos with all these bright melodic washes. The melodies on this track weirdly remind me of like old Motown artists like the Temptations. And some of those bass lines are really deep and satisfying. Even the lower key interludes like the moody Rhodes pianos on Liverpool or the clunky strangeness of Foghorn did well to add variety to the project. It leaves me pretty conflicted on the album as a whole. There's lots of things I really like about it. I feel they did a better job of pinning down a specific sound and identity they could call their own, and there are more high points with fewer low points. But there's still nothing here that comes even close to the first two tracks on Love and Devotion, and between that and my being less hot on the vocals, we end up with an album that I have more respect for, and I think is better crafted, but I'm probably less likely to return to, which I think evens out to me feeling, I guess, the same amount of personal enjoyment as before. It's a good album, but not a great one for me. I'm feeling a light 7.3 on this one as well. Now, to close this massive roundup out, I felt like we ought to finish on a less conflicted note, so we're going to end this off with his collaboration with Speedy J, of all people, under the name Slag Boom Van Loon, under which there has only been one album released, a self-titled project from 1998, as well as a companion album of remixes called So Soon in 2001 that I didn't bother to listen to, but it has remixes from Boards of Canada, Fortet, Tipper, Coil, and Matmos, among others. If you're interested, that's a thing that exists. But yeah, self-titled album from Slag Boom Van Loon. This was a team-up that had me intrigued because Speedy J, despite operating in a lot of the same genres as PARADINAS, always had a very different approach to his sound that was markedly darker and took itself way more seriously on average. Especially around the time this album dropped and he was in his more experimental Public Energy #1 and Shocking Hobby phase. I was definitely interested to see how their styles would end up working off each other. And yeah, this is definitely another change of pace that isn't like anything else I've covered in this roundup. This project is basically an experimental ambient release. 12 tracks of strange excursions through lots of odd formless experimental synth textures and unnerving but consistently present melodies. And as you might be able to tell from the way I started this segment, this project I think is also properly great. Perhaps my perspective is skewed a bit from having sat through so many PARADINAS side projects for this video, but this album does not feel like a collection of throwaways or like just some random side effort. This album actually has some dramatic stakes and a sense of greater scale and weight and depth behind it that I feel like I haven't gotten out of most of these projects. Both artists were properly bringing their A-game to this album, and it doesn't just feel like a combination of their separate styles either. They sound like they were actively trying to find common ground and present themselves as like more of a single unit. The chemistry between them is solid enough where it can even be difficult to figure out who contributes what. I mean, Speedy J does melodic stuff too, and PARADINAS does dark metallic stuff too. It's also cool how, despite how unassumingly minimalistic and formless a lot of these pieces can be, they still keep my attention pretty much the whole way through. A track like Casual basically just meanders through sludgy synth and squelching percussion with barely any melody for 8 minutes, but has just enough of a steady evolution to keep me invested the whole way through. There's tracks like Butch or Broccoli, not the same broccoli as the Kid Spatula one, that add up to interestingly hypnotic tribal sounding sort of mixes out of their minimal synth textures, like how the former is mostly just glassy bell melodies making really dissonant and bassy chords with some later flute accompaniment. or the latter is just a meander through unnerving pads and wobbling percussion. Feels like there may be some influence from like Indian or Japanese classical music or something. Maybe you'll run into some more off-kilter acid techno on Poppy Seed, or the even more dramatic and openly melodic interlude Brumtullen. The particular texture on some of the bells on there remind me a bit of Royal Astronomy, although they're being recontextualized into something very different. There's also, of course, no shortage of cuts that focus on an even lower key ambient sound. Right near the beginning of the album, there's a 5-minute solo piano piece in SPC-CHPN that hits on a particularly deep emotional level. Reminds me a lot of the way Speedy J's A Shocking Hobby ended. Honestly, might do that sound even better. There's a mix of very warm and comforting melodic ambient pads in Mushi, and a similar mix of pads on Suteja that gets much bassier on average, with a lot of plinking and paddling electronic percussion that sounds somewhere between like bongos and dripping water. And the closer pedals is a particularly dramatic and satisfying way to go out, despite being nothing but blocky pads being constantly filtered in and out, next to a few screeching noises later on that sound like scraping violins or something. It really leaves an impact on you in that Tim Hecker kind of way. But of course, the biggest highlights of all are the 2 longest tracks, which make for huge, epic centerpieces. Even though they're not in the center of the album, they're more like bookends. The opener, Light of India, is really dang cool. Starts out with some light and friendly minimal IDM arrangements and gets progressively louder and envelops itself with more and more distorted noise, building up and paying off gloriously over the course of its 9-minute running time. And the even longer 10-minute penultimate track, Fallen Angels Entering Pandemonium, is just as high stakes as its title makes it sound. You first got a subtle if mildly tense ambient intro, then you're hit with all these crashing off-kilter breakbeats, and the track just keeps building up further and further to the most over-the-top symphonic level with synth strings and choirs and everything. Not even to get into the side tracks for church bells and more ambient synth pads and even a bit of piano soloing at the end. Oh yeah, and I guess the bonus track, Moonbase Alpha, is some nice experimental wobbling too, though that's not essential to the experience. But overall, damn, this album was really fucking cool. I don't really have anything to complain about here. It's well-paced, well-sequenced, really immersive, and knows how to balance the subtlety with the off-kilter strangeness in a way that totally pulled me in. Maybe some tracks hit on a deeper level for me than others, and I don't see it being for everyone, but this turned out to be a real hidden gem. I can definitely see myself keeping it around. I'll give it an 8.3 out of 10. And that's finally going to be it. That is all the Mike PARADINAS I have the patience to go through today. Actually, probably a lot more than I think I had the patience for. There is, again, plenty more that I skipped over there, but I'm sorry, I'm so tired by this video. This video is every bit as exhausting to put together as it probably looks like it was from the outside, and as I fully anticipated it to be when I started this series. And it's probably not going to get a ton of attention, as tends to be the case with odds and ends videos, but as many headaches as it took for me to make this video, I am actually still glad I went through with it. First of all, it really gave me perspective on how much editing went into all his albums, especially earlier on. This madman was finishing a track like every single day of the entire 90s, and it must have taken some serious work to get albums like Tango, Invective, or Bluff Limbo down to only an hour and a half. And for as much forgettable filler as his vast archives unsurprisingly have, there's tons of hidden gems too. I probably heard like 6 entire hours worth of material, if not more, that I enjoyed enough to want to properly keep around longer term, and that I would not have listened to if I didn't force myself through all of this, so yeah, I'll take that as a win at least. Even after being burnt out on PARADINAS' sound multiple times over the course of writing this, I didn't come out at the end with any less of a high opinion of his work than I did before. And for all the people who made it all the way through this video, I extend my sincerest thanks. I hope you enjoyed watching it and found some hidden gems in his catalog you'd want to keep yourself. Now there's only a top 10 and a worst to best ranking left, and we'll be officially done with this discography review. I am just glad for this particular video to be over and done with. And yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.